to run a modern ocean activist group, you have to be diversified in all your resources and all your tools. But you still need that symbol, that inspiration that sparks the start, and that is Paul Watson. It's been an international outrage and outcry in regards to his arrest. It's abuse of the justice system, a biased situation for profit and money. Denmark has a choice to be on the good or bad side of history here. If they did extradite him to Japan, it is a death sentence. The oceans are our lungs, and we need a healthy ocean to maintain that balance. And we're getting to that tipping point. Climate change is affecting things. The oceans are dying. People like Paul Watson are being persecuted. More of these illegal activities continue, even against international law. Eventually, who's going to pay the price? The future generation. We really have to rethink how the economy works. It has to be a system which serves the biodiversity of the planet rather than just the financial needs of certain people.
From Nuuk, Greenland, I'm Chad Copeland, and joining me is Omar Todd, CEO of the Captain Paul Watson Foundation. Omar, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Chad. Good to be here.
Bring us into the situation. What's going on right now?
Well, at the moment, we were going to Japan's waters, the North Pacific, taking the JPD, the vessel that we had for the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, over to the Northwest Channel, and we had to stop to refuel on the way here in Greenland. While we were here, travelling over to the Northwest Passage, Captain Paul Watson was captaining the vessel, and when we pulled in to port, essentially 14 men came on board the vessel and arrested Captain Paul Watson. We didn't know what it was about to begin with. And then we found out very quickly it was on a request from Japan to the Danish authorities to arrest him on an Interpol red notice submitted back in 2010. So that's what sort of happened. So he was arrested in Greenland, in Nuuk here, and remanded in custody. And now we are obviously trying to figure out what's going on, why have they done it, how long is it going to take. And it's now, I think it's the 7th week he's been in prison on remand, and a couple of small court appearances here. And at the moment, nothing really has happened. It's been a can kick between the Greenland authorities and the Denmark Minister of Justice. And that's where we're at.
How's Paul doing right now?
Paul's probably the most relaxed out of all of us, determined, focused. I have admiration every time I go in there. He's pretty chilled out. He doesn't see this as a inconvenience for himself so much. He feels now it's brought more attention to the issue of whaling than Japan ever wanted. It's been an international outrage and outcry in regards to his arrest based on these charges, which are over 10 years old. They're pretty feeble under the laws of both Greenland, Denmark. They're more or less hooliganism charges. One's trespass, one is damage to property, and the third one is possible injury to a crew member on board the Japanese vessels. And that's the one they're really holding him on in remand. And that's the one we're arguing about, or the defence is arguing, that isn't an issue. So he's had 2 court appearances so far, both of which the Japanese or the prosecutor has entered some evidence that something happened in 2012, and that the reality is that we're trying to present our evidence and it's not happening. They're not allowing the evidence to go forward in court. We don't know why. The Japanese are allowed their evidence and we're not allowed our evidence. And we continue to push that. We've had 2 appeals to the upper court and they've refused them as well. I think he misses his family. He's got 2 young boys and a wife back in Marseille in France. That's the thing that bothers him the most. But essentially, he has now turned this arrest into a campaign in itself. We joke and say it's Operation Nuuk Prison now, So that's how he's adjusted. He always finds a way to make a situation work for the cause. Mm-hmm. And that's one of his amazing media abilities.
What's at risk here? right now, with Paul potentially having to be extradited to Japan, or what's happening in that space?
Well, the risk for Paul is that if he gets extradited, it's essentially a life sentence. At 73 years old, we all know the conviction rate of Japan, which is 99.8%, if I recall. And it's not a fair justice system. They've been condemned internationally for their system. So we know if he gets extradited, it is a death sentence. The charges he's on, one of them, the particular assault or damage and charges and trespass, they all add up to a possible 15-year sentence. So at 73 years old, suffering through the injustice of a Japanese prison system, he's gone, And that's what concerns us most. But also it sets a precedent. And the precedent's dangerous.
That's very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
So he leaves 2 children behind and a wife. Tell me more there.
Yeah, well, they're young kids. One's 3, one's 7, turning 8. A possible chess champion. He's certainly up in the ranks. He's up in the top 30, I believe, in the US for his age. The oldest one, Tiger Watson. Yeah, and they're missing their father. I mean, they understand what he does, particularly the eldest. And his wife, of course. But no one expected this particular incident to happen. I mean, we double-checked before he left on campaign. We looked at the Interpol system, which raises questions. Why wasn't it in the system beforehand? Why could he travel between France and Ireland and other countries without a problem? And just when he goes to Greenland, I guess a Denmark protected country, he gets nabbed there. Why was it there that the Faroese, which is islands off Denmark who still whale, notified the Danish authorities and the Greenlandic authorities to get him in Greenland? So so what's at stake? Well, it's an abuse of power. It's abuse of the justice system. I mean, you can't just cherry pick the Interpol warrant system to deceive and catch someone you want to remove in a conservation or an activist themselves. And that's what's being used for, and that's what concerns us.
What do you think is driving this?
Well, we think what drives most of these problems is money. I mean, we do know the Faroese who have the Grindelap, where they drive pilot whales into the bay, and they all say it's tradition. They all run down to the beach and start hacking and killing the whales that they drive into the beach, and they turn up with their BMWs and their latest cars with their kids and things, and they try to make it sound like it's a tradition that they need the food when it's been proven that there's too much mercury content in there. They've got modern supermarkets. You don't need to do it anymore. And they're the ones that complained to the Danish authorities, the Greenland authorities, that Paul was back on the Interpol system just under Danish law, or the Danes, and then they picked him up in Greenland. So we think it's about the Faroese wanting to stop the scrutiny on their particular practice in the Faroe Islands. And this has done the opposite. Now all eyes are pivoting to them, and we'll make sure that will happen.
I've been following this behavior and their culture, of course, for many years, and it just puts the most disgusting pit in my stomach to watch that and see what they're doing.
It's a blood sport.
It is a blood sport.
It's a blood sport. And, they talk about being a tradition. It's not been more than 300-400 years, and it's fairly modern. I mean, as I said, you could understand it maybe 300-400 years ago, but it has no place in the modern era. You can go to the supermarket and get anything you need. No one eats it there. They store it, and then they push the rest off the cliff when no one's looking. But of course, we have crews there. We're always looking. We're filming it, and we'll keep filming it and bringing it to the world's attention. But essentially, they wanted to get rid of Paul to cover that up. And obviously, there's a couple other whaling nations, but particularly in this case, it was the Faroese that squealed on Paul and using a Interpol system that should not be abused, which it is.
It seems like there's a great conflict of interest here, because Greenland, for instance, they have specific practices specifically for their indigenous people. It feels like Greenland is not as invested in this as Denmark is. And what's up with that?
Well, I think, we certainly have no issue with Greenland so much. And by the fact that they had 14 special officers fly in from Copenhagen, to arrest Paul with a special prosecutor shows that the Greenland people had nothing much to do with it. They were quite surprised, I think. And they don't, they have their own issues with the Danes as well, and they like to keep their culture alive. And Indigenous whaling is something that, is a small issue here in comparison to the Faroese issue, where, as I said, the Faroese turn up with BMWs, Mercedes to drive pilot whales with their modern vessels, their modern boats, their speed boats, effectively, to trap them and then just kill them in a bloodbath. It's completely different to Indigenous whaling in Greenland. And, I think most people, reasonable people, if you ask them, if you showed them the differences, they would clearly say, well, Faroese, that's horrible what they do there. Indigenous, one whale here and there, it's a little bit different, particularly up as you go further north in Greenland, where it gets more cold and there's less resources. I mean, we all know, being here in Nuuk, it's not the easiest place to get food and supplies to.
That's right. Perhaps a little bit inhospitable, but bring me into Japan's interest and how that layers in. Why are they so interested, not only for their own whaling practices, but what's here that they have an interest in? Why is the Danish government, feeding into this desire to persecute Paul?
Yeah, you would think it'd be in their interest. Here you have a conservationist, ocean conservationist, who's been held by the Danes, who are effectively an EU nation, or a part of the EU, where it's illegal to do whaling. It's not a very good look optically. And we've been wondering ourselves, why would they do this? You've got a progressive prime minister who says she's all for whale watching and she loves the environment, and yet they are holding one of the world's most prominent environmentalists on the request of another country on charges which are quite feeble when you look at them. So why would they do that? Why would they tarnish their image? And the only thing we can come up with is the fact that, well, they are a whaling nation via the Faroese. And I guess Greenland in some ways as well, on a smaller level. We know the Japanese delegation at end of 2023 were here in Greenland doing trade deals. We know they were continuing doing trade deals with Denmark as well. And we think it must be something to do with the undercurrent of arrangements they have financially. I mean, Japan's, I think, the world's fourth largest economy. So therefore, they've got an interest in keeping the subsidized whaling industry going. You've got to remember, Japan spent 47 or so million US dollars on this new factory citation Death Star, we call it, the Kangimaru. And the Kangimaru has just been completed. It's brand new. It's out there now, killing whales off the coast of Japan. And the last thing they wanted was our ships to arrive and start to engage, or at least show what was going on. And that's why I think that really has pushed the buttons in Japan to put pressure on Denmark and Greenland to detain Paul for as long as possible, while they're literally whaling as we speak. And they've killed their first fin whales for the first time in 50 years, just the last few days. And, they're starting to push the whole idea of commercial whaling again. And we think it's simply a matter of time before they go back to the Southern Ocean. At the moment, they're saying they're not, but this ship has been designed and built for range. It's been designed and built for long range and cold weather in its ice class. So at the end of the day, it's primed to be going down to the Southern Ocean. And we think that's all tied into why.
Interesting. Tell me the difference between commercial whaling and indigenous whaling. Is there a difference?
Well, essentially the difference is what's the vessels and the quota. So in terms of commercial whaling, you've got hundreds of whales being killed in a factory ship, which just brings them up a ramp and just, strips them down, boxes and freezes them ready for market. I mean, that's nothing to do with indigenous whaling, whereas this one or two will be killed for the local town. So essentially, it's about the number of whales killed and how they're processed.
Speaking of boats, where is the boat that Paul brought here right before he was arrested? Where's that now?
So yes, the Jean-Paul de Doria, that is now currently in Halifax. We are going to move it soon. While the Japanese may believe our campaigns are not going ahead without Paul, That's not quite true. We're simply reassessing. And what we have learnt with this new era of activism is maybe we should keep more quiet about what we're doing next. And we just do what we've done in the past and appear in places that they don't want us to appear. And that's what we're looking at. So our vessels now will start moving around. And we notice that the biggest problem in the modern era is that you have systems called AIS, little signal devices that allow you to see what ships are out on the ocean. But more and more illegal fishing and whaling operations, they just simply turn them off. So we realize that we have to up our game and be more resourceful and more secretive on how we tackle these issues in the future, and including the Japanese whale, with or without Paul. So we intend to continue on our campaigns, and that does include the Operation Kangimaru.
Speaking of with or without Paul, what does this operation look like if Japan does take him and he serves the rest of his days in a prison in Japan?
Well, firstly, it would keep bringing pressure to Japan about his arrest and his detainment. So I don't think it's going to give them any relief. And it's just going to embolden the new generation. We have plenty of people who are volunteering already. We've had thousands of volunteers in the last few months alone that are ready to go and do a campaign. And now his arrest has simply amplified that message out. And people also are fed up with just how unfair it is. I mean, if you just objectively look at it, you go, well, how can this be? How can this environmentalist who's protecting the ocean, who's got international law behind him, who's enforcing the law when governments should be doing it instead of us, in prison by a country who proclaims to be an anti-whaling nation under EU regulations, being held on behalf of another country where the law is over 10 years old, these allegations, and it's not fair. And anyone's reasonable principle fairness sort of meter would go, hang on a minute, this doesn't look right, this doesn't smell right. And I think that will bring more people to us. We have captains ready to go and do this action as well. And I think it's just going to make more and more people volunteer, because we all see the writing on the wall. We all understand that if the oceans die, we die, and we need to do something about it. And just because you arrest one person and you may martyr them, only bring more support over to us. And Paul's view is that this has become a campaign in itself.
What's at stake here? There's not a lot of people out there like Paul, right? Our modern day superheroes, really, that are trying to protect the ocean, the marine mammals, marine life. Are there many people out there?
No, you won't find many organizations that do what Paul does, led by anyone like Paul does. Paul's one of a kind. And I think the new generation's realizing that it's more difficult to do the things that Paul used to do and still does, but certainly 20, 30 years ago. I mean, as the CEO of this organization now that we've started in 2022, a new organization, just the compliance, the red tape, you have to be very innovative on how you build up your organization, how you fundraise. You need to be a registered charity to get the big donors in, and then you need to go, well, how are you going to get support out? So it's technology driven. I mean, I always joke these days, we don't really run ships anymore. We really are a media organization, to win hearts and minds. And what's at stake? Well, everything. I mean, the oceans are our lungs. They provide the oxygen we breathe. And people often say to me, well, it's the Amazon, what's this? I says, no, it's the oceans that provide a good 70%, because the phytoplankton provides the oxygen, and the whales are the farmers of the sea, and they go and poop out tons of poo. And of course, the poop filters down and feeds the phytoplankton, and it creates that cycle of life and the carbon sequestration and everything we need. And we need a healthy ocean to maintain that balance. And, more or less, that what's happening is the balance is being tipped to the other way. The oceans are dying. People like Paul Watson are being held and remanded and persecuted. And more of these illegal activities continue, even against international law. Eventually, who's going to pay the price? The future generations. So our job is now to make as much noise as we can, but we also understand that technology and being innovative in the face of all these new rules and regulations. You have to be more innovative, and social media has given us other avenues. Technology has given us different paths to push the media message out that we didn't have 5-10 years ago. So it's unusual. I certainly think to run a modern ocean activist group, you have to be diversified in all your resources and all your tools, but you still need that symbol, that inspiration that sparks the start, and that is Paul Watson. And I suppose my biggest concern is that once Paul, and we hope not for a long time, is not around anymore, then who's next? And that question right now is an open question.
Does this look like one of these situations where they're trying to cut the head of the snake off and they think that it's just going to stop?
Absolutely, yeah. But what I've found within the organisation, it's inspiring others to step up. In fact, I'm at this stage, we're focusing on the freepaulwatson.org campaign, of course, but we are looking at the next campaigns now, and I have more people coming to us now than ever before, wanting to volunteer and stand up. So I think there's the next Paul Watsons there, and maybe in time they will arise. We certainly have some captains that are inspirational that have been working with Paul and us for years. But right now, it is about Paul. We hope that this is just a momentary problem and that he won't be extradited. There is a lot of procedures before, even if he does get extradited, and the Justice Minister in Denmark says, okay, you can go to Japan. They then have to go to the district court, then a high court, and then the Court of Human Rights in Europe. So there's a lot of procedures before that happens. But in the meantime, it's time.
Right.
But sooner or later, we'll make a decision to continue our campaigns.
What did this look like in the beginning? Today, we're dealing with social media, which is one of these new developments in the last 20, 30 years. What did that movement look like for Paul in the very early days? How did this start, and why do marine mammals, why do they matter? Why should the people of the planet be looking into taking this seriously?
Well, Paul's always had an affinity for life. I mean, he used to collect beaver traps in his youth, and then it built up to getting a ship and stopping whaling happening, and that's became his thing. And certainly he started off with Make a Wave Committee back in 1971, 72, and then I think he was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. In fact, his membership was 007 because he thought that was pretty cool, being the same as James Bond. And then he left Greenpeace in around 1977. Basically, he was voted out, I think 11-1, because he wanted to continue the direct action, and Greenpeace didn't want to do that. The rest of the people didn't want to do that. So he started his own organisation, Sea Shepherd. And Sea Shepherd was always about direct action. And of course, he went to a couple of donors and said, look, I want to go out and stop these people whaling. And he got the funds for a ship. And back in those days, you just go and buy a ship. It was much more simple, and you didn't have to have all the insurances and the compliance and the documentation. So we bought a ship, and then he started doing what he did then, and going out into the oceans and stopping, illegal whaling. And then he had I think the campaign that really put him on the map was the anti-sealing campaign in Canada. And what he did was he got Bridget Bardot on board, and and flew her in there, and managed to do a campaign with her holding a cuddly little seal with fur, and that exploded the movement. And he understood very early on that the media was his weapon, and that's how he could get the message out. And that back then was easier to do. You had 5-10 outlets. You could get newspaper coverage or TV coverage. Now, as we know, it's a lot more complicated. So, over the years, back even when I started in 2007, 2008, they had one vessel. They were still sending brochures out to solicit funds for donors. And then we were like, well, maybe you should look at a website.
Right, yes.
Yeah. And then I remember saying to some of the captains at the time with their one ship, well, I think we should get on Facebook and we should, start social media. And
Very early days.
Very early days, that's right. And I was sort of like, what's that? People were saying, what's that? We're not going to bother with that. That's stupid.
Well, speaking of voices, the 1970s, I want to say it was the early 70s, is when somebody made the first actual recording of a humpback whale song.
Dr. Payne.
Yes.
He did that, yes. And it's the same whale song that got imprinted on the Voyager.
Oh, it is?
Voyager satellites. They get sent
so
off. That's with the golden record.
Out of our solar system.
Correct. So Dr. Roger Payne was the one that inspired that. And Paul and him were neighbours in Vermont until very recently.
Interesting.
So we used to go to dinner at Dr. Payne's place all the time. Unfortunately, he passed away last year or two. So, but he was a leader in his industry, and he inspired Paul as well to continue to fight for the whales.
One of the things that I understand about whale songs and simply marine mammal communications, right, are these bioacoustics. What are bioacoustics doing today in the field of science, and can our understanding through AI, perhaps, technology, machine learning technology, help us find a better path forward for all marine life, especially the humpbacks?
Well, bringing back a theory, it's not a new theory. If we all remember Star Trek 4, we now know that whales speak a language, and it's over a lot further distances than we ever anticipated. We also know that they're just starting to crack the code. Literally in the last few months, and some possible wording, they've got much more complex language than we thought. And I think AI definitely will bring that up much quicker and really show us what they're saying. Now, it's going to be interesting. What would they say to us?
Right.
I think first of all, they'd probably say, will you stop making so much goddamn noise? Because we think that noise pollution in the oceans is one of the biggest problems.
Well, and we saw that during the pandemic when all the commercial tourism and everything shut down, and all of those ships and everything kind of got out of the way, even on land, species started to recover.
Yeah, Paul often talks about basically if we want to recover the oceans, all we need to do is simply leave it alone.
Right.
You let nature do its thing. We just have a moratorium on any whaling or fishing or anything like that. Particularly if we manage to do it for like a third of the oceans at the very minimum, we probably wouldn't have the crisis we have now with the ocean acidification and the private fishing population. So all we need to do to repair everything is simply leave it alone. Get out of the way. Yeah. And I believe that when that happened with the COVID period, that migration paths that haven't been used in decades were starting to be used again by certain species of whales.
Sure.
And they all started readjusting very quickly to the days before all this traffic was around. So for sure, all we need to do is simply leave it alone, and that'll recover things quickly.
Right before I came to New Greenland, I watched The Hunt for the Red October. And I remember they were talking about hearing whale sounds, and there was this silent drive that the Red October had. Is that a technology that could maybe help abate some of this noise pollution?
Well, that caterpillar drive, which was what it was called, I believe, that actually did that in the Soviet Union. They had a working version of that, and that's what the film was based on. Mm-hmm. It didn't actually ever get up there because I think there was just a maintenance issue. But I think for sure, once we work out that there's a correlation between the noise and beachings and problems with migration paths, I am positive we'll start rethinking on what we do with that. As I said to you a little moment ago, on Flight Radar, which is an app anyone can download, you can see over 5,000 planes in the air at any one time.
That's right.
Well, there's a marine app as well. You can see that, and there's about 6,000 or 7,000 vessels in the oceans at the same time, all running around for hundreds of miles. That must be affecting that.
People need things. How do we get around that? And what's a solution that's best for everybody?
You're getting into an area of the part of the problem is the globalization of things, Globalization is well and good, but as you see, it can affect things. When you eat something like shrimp or prawns in Australia and it's been imported from Thailand, but it's actually shelled in the USA,
Right.
is getting to the stage where it's getting ridiculous. So we really have to rethink how the economy works. It has to be a system which serves the biodiversity of the planet rather than just the financial needs of
More
certain
local
people.
sourcing.
Local sourcing, yeah. I mean, this is a longer topic for another time, but generally speaking, we have to rethink how we do commerce. And until we get to the stage where I think there's a crisis, that's we won't be thinking about it until then. And we're getting to that tipping point. Already climate change is affecting things. Mankind is causing so much damage to the environment that we're actually starting to see the effects of it. And yet it's still being denied. The science is all there. It's been there for 5-10 years now. So I think in the next few years, there will be an awakening, particularly in the new generation, because they'll realize that it's a lot worse than it was 20, 30 years ago. And they're going to have to do something about it.
Well, what are the next steps for Paul? What is he looking at?
Paul will have to have some patience. And we have to have some faith that in the end, the pressure will keep building up and that fairness comes into play. What's right, what's wrong. Denmark has a choice to be on the good or bad side of history here. And just for a moment, think if they did extradite him to Japan, it would be a stain that they never recover from.
That's right.
And if they do let him out, then obviously he will continue what he does. And I think he should be lauded for that and praised for that and good. And that's what we hope. If he doesn't, though, in the meantime, I think the strategy is simply to keep him waiting. I mean, in the European Parliament today, people were pointing out that, I think about out of 20 or so MPs, 19 were positive for Paul and showed concern. And one even attributed to a similar case to Julian Assange, a whistleblower, essentially, except an environmental whistleblower who's bringing light into something that shouldn't happen, is being persecuted for it, and people are getting fed up with it.
So the majority recognizes how wrong this is.
Yeah, that's right. And it's just going to take time for it to filter through the system. Not too much time, we hope.
Sure.
But it will take time. In a real ideal world, he should have been let out the same day.
Right.
But we all know that's not the world we live in. We have to build pressure up. We have to keep the pressure on, and we have to let everyone know how unfair this is.
We're lacking due process here.
The due process disappeared back in when this was originally lodged by Interpol. By Japan, and enforced by Interpol. Mm-hmm. We're certainly looking at Interpol's relation to this and why are they even entertaining it. The thing is, if you're going to have a modern democracies and you want people to follow the rule of law, there has to be a point where you have to have a belief in the laws doing the thing that's best for us all.
That's right.
And I think in a case like this, it shows that this is not what we want. It's not the best for us. It's clearly a biased situation for profit and money based in a country that, that still whales commercially when it denies it does, and, against international law when it just ignored it, against an Australian court ruling back in 2010 that's ignored. So the rule of law starts breaking down because you don't have faith in it anymore because no one's following it, including the people that are breaking it. And yet they've used the same laws to put someone in jail who's trying to enforce them.
Are Paul's family able to come and visit him at all while he's here?
Well, the situation is complicated because the prison's a very small prison. They seem to change the rules day to day. So, you could come here at a great expense. It's a very difficult place to get to on small Dash 8 planes. It's becoming winter now, so it's going to get more difficult to fly here. So you'd have to also stop at a few stopovers. So it's expensive, it's difficult, logistically complicated. And when you do get here, you may or may not be able to see him as often as you want.
Have you had an opportunity to see any evidence from 2010?
So the interesting thing about the Danish law system, which is convenient for Japan in this case, is that you as a person who's been alleged to do a crime, your lawyers get nominated first to look at the evidence. And as the defendant, you can't even look at the evidence. Only the Danish lawyers can look at the evidence, and they can talk with the prosecutor. And in most cases, you can't even see what you're being charged for. Now, in this case, we know, but we can't see all the details because under Danish law, you're not supposed to know all the details. Because if you're acquitted, you might not even know what you're acquitted for. The fact is, you just acquitted. And that's sort of like to preserve your innocence. So it's a peculiar aspect of Danish law. So what we do know is that, there's these three sort of charges from back in the day, from 2010, which was trespass, which was when Pete Bethune jumped on board the vessel to present to the Japanese captain an invoice for his ship that was rammed, the Artigal, in half, and to politely present him with the invoice and say, hey, you owe me some money. So when he jumped on board the vessel, he cut the net and jumped on board. Secondly, it was about damage. Oh, he damaged the net jumping on board, because he cut it. So you got trespass, you got damage. And then the third part of the charges were when they were driving around the delta, around the Japanese vessel, that they shot off a stink bomb, which is effectively just rotten butter, onto a part of the deck, which exploded, and they alleged that one of their crew members got injured, and that's the one that's, causing all the problems. The other two misdemeanors, hooliganism, are simple fines in all three countries, Japan, Greenland, and Denmark. So it's really about the possible assault charge, or damage on someone's face where they got a little bit of damage under their eye. And yet we found out later that this evidence, first of all, that the three crew members that said they got hurt, only one of them actually had any damage on their eye that they said they did. Secondly, we know that they had some pepper spray weapons at the time that they shot into themselves, which is what our footage shows.
And it blew back onto
them. And it
blew
back onto them, yeah. So from our point of view, all they've done is shot themselves, and they're using that incident to try and enforce their particular narrative that Pete Bethune shot at them and hurt them directly. And we know that they burnt the actual clothing, had to burn all the evidence, and that's the same guy that testified that he got hurt was the same guy that ran over the Artigal vessel, who was the helmsman at the time.
I wonder where he is today.
Yeah,
what his benefits are.
That's right. I mean, so that was what we know. And then when we went to court, the court allowed the prosecutor to show the evidence of, for the first time, the Japanese point of view with their camera crew on board, which they synced with their watch when they filmed their watch, and they synced the delta moving around the vessel, and and the actual flash of the potato gun that launched the stink bomb onto the vessel. But what they won't do is allow our footage of the same moment and the same time, and you can hear the crew on both videos go Yahoo when they launched the particular stink bomb into the area of the vessel, which clearly shows there was no one there on our footage, which was under the research sign, the little R on the side of the vessel. There was nobody there. So we think that's very peculiar. They won't allow us to demonstrate that with our evidence that there was no one there, but they allow the Japanese to present their evidence.
Where was Paul physically located when this altercation took place?
He was physically located in his cabin, and the actual captain at the time on our side was Captain Lockie McLean, and he was at the top being the captain. Paul was physically in his cabin, and and obviously didn't know exactly what was going on from the moment to moment. That's not how it works, and it was all recorded, thankfully, by the Animal Planet Whale Roars crew. So we actually have it all on film. Normally you wouldn't even have it on film. So here you have a situation. Right. We've actually got the acts they're talking about on film, and no one wants to see it because it exonerates him immediately.
That's right.
Immediately.
And it ruins their campaign.
It ruins everything for them.
Now, before they started this, did they know that footage existed?
Yes. It's been online on YouTube for years. Anyone can look it up.
Yes.
What footage no one had seen was their footage. And when we saw it, we didn't see anything like, oh no, that's terrible. It aligned with our footage.
That's right.
So the fact that they still won't look at our footage makes one question the process completely. I mean, how can you bring evidence to a court and only have one side? I mean, this is about the fairness measure I was telling you about.
It is.
Everything about this is off.
And that footage has been released to the world, right? So everyone has seen that.
Yeah, and so they talk about it being based on a law. I mean, how is it not political? How is it not political? None of the laws applying here. The fact he shouldn't be in there, the statute of limitations apply, the fact that it's over 10 years old, it's laws under all other countries that are illegal what they did in the Southern Ocean. And yet, the only law that's being followed here is the Japanese law because the flag country of the ship was Japan. So because when you have a flag under a ship which is from Japan, that's the law they're applying based if anyone was trespassing in Japan or causing damage in Japan or assaulting someone in Japan, that law applies, but none of the other laws do.
So this is very interesting. There's a lot of pressure, and this entire thing pivots on this one individual who may have had a little something happen to his face, perhaps a scratch.
Yeah.
And have we heard from him at all in the last couple of years?
No, not at all. And in Japan, it's hard to get witnesses because once the prosecutor gets their statements, they tend to disappear. And I mean, he's probably retired. We certainly thought about looking into it, and finding out what he said. But he said he was one of the people that actually drove into the Arctic Girl and steered into it. So out of all the people that would or would not testify, he would be probably a hostile witness anyway because he was in the industry. I think if I had to speculate, I think that they just used it as an opportunity to push their narrative forward because the evidence points to everything else.
And the entire government of Japan, and now, of course, Denmark, is behind this scratch on an individual's face, allegedly, to persecute Paul because of what he stands for.
You can't see it any other way. I mean, at the end of the day, is you look at every aspect of this case, it just doesn't work. I mean, on evidence, there's nothing there. It's a nothing burger,
Right.
And yet he's been detained on an international warrant for essentially fines, things that we get fined for. No one was, and in 45 plus years, Paul's never injured and hurt anybody. That's one of the main things he does. He calls it passive non-aggressive violence, right? He does not maim or hurt anybody. Life is sacred to him. So he would have never ordered this to happen. And it's on camera that he advised people not to do this. So, I mean, you've got video evidence, you've got very old charges, you've got dubious witness statements, you've got one-sided evidence that's been presented. You've got a country that, like Denmark, it's supposed to uphold international laws. It's been regarded as one of a respected EU nation. What's going on?
That's right.
I mean, this doesn't look right.
What's the call to action here? What can people do around the world to help support?
Well, in the first instance, what we want people to do is sign the petition on our website because we use that to help push pressure back onto governments. And that is very easy. People can just go to www.freepaulwatson.org and also hashtag #FreePaulWatson. And we've been using that hashtag everywhere. But essentially, they go onto the website, they sign the petition. That helps us get more pressure, more signatures, more email addresses to then add pressure to all the various governments and the courts that we do. Just like the European Union did today, where they spoke in favour of Paul in the European Parliament. And that was because of the campaigning from people all over the world, making everybody aware of what's going on and how unfair it is, and that's how someone who's such a legend in the environmental causes and business and an organisation, how he's been unfairly prosecuted against the wishes of the world to essentially back up an old charge based on business and commercialisation of whaling 10 plus years ago that was deemed illegal by International Court of Justice and the Australian Federal Court. And I don't know why we're still even entertaining the idea that this is a fair situation. So people can sign up there and we can then do something about it.
So this is, in a way, the ultimate sacrifice to stand up for marine mammals and wildlife around the world. And although Paul seems like he's willing to do it, I hope that it doesn't go down that road.
Yes, Paul will be there. He will never capitulate. I don't see that happening. He is a iron-willed character. He will never go against his own principles. And, obviously we don't want a martyr. But at the same time, if that's what it takes, we often get crew when they sign up. Are you prepared to give your life to save a whale? And Paul walks that walk and talks that talk, and he means it. So he'll be there as long as he needs to be, and hopefully it won't be that long. But the longer he's there, the more this is coming to light. And the more this comes into the public arena, the more pressure is on Japan and Denmark and Greenland, particularly Denmark, to explain why he's still there.
Well, on a lighter note, what's Paul's favorite thing about whales?
I think I'd have to say he loves the whale song. I've heard him listening to it before. He likes writing about it as well. Poetry, he's a poet at heart, so he does a lot of poetry. He writes about the whales. He likes to look at pictures. I wouldn't say he goes into the ocean very much, but he's more of a dreamer. He's a poet. He's a romantic. So he'd be writing about it. So that's what he does more or less too. And what he loves about the whales. They're such beautiful creatures to write about.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me, and best of luck.
Thank you, Chad. It's been good to be here. Thank you.